So Wizards of the Coast have now officially started advertising for their new revised core books, or what most people are colloquially calling Edition 5.5. Now, to be fair, most of this video is going to be based off of knowledge from reading the various playtest packets, and the final version will undoubtedly have some changes in it that haven't yet been revealed, but based on everything they've shown up to this point, I think I can confidently say that the final books will greatly resemble the playtest material. And right off the bat, I do want to say up front that I do think that 5.5 is a massive improvement over the base game. A lot of feats and spells and abilities are just much better balanced and designed in general. Classes, especially the martial classes in particular, have been given a lot more interesting tools to play with that actually make them more fun and engaging. I mean, hell, there are barbarian subclasses that I actually want to play for a change. Plus, even the early game is better with things like feats being given out at level 1 now and way more interesting options for when you want to pick what species you want to play. But for all of the good things that I have to say about the update, it does also feel like they're clearly afraid of going a little bit too far with some ideas. Maybe they're being held back a bit by this being just an update to an existing edition, but I really think that they could have gone at least a little further in just some areas. And one of those areas that I really want to talk about today is weapon masteries. So, I've already talked a lot about the classic martial and caster divide, the imbalance that is inherent to the game between the magical classes and the non-magical classes. That was actually one of my first videos that did well on this channel, so link in the description if you want to go back and check that out. But to quickly go over one of the bigger problems, martial classes just really aren't that interesting to play. Most of your turns ultimately boil down to I run up and hit it with my sword, and then you roll damage, and then it's the next person's turn. Your choice of weapons barely matter, and they don't really allow you to really express yourself in any meaningful capacity. And just in general, not only are your turns less interesting, but you often don't have much that you could actually contribute to a fight beyond raw damage. Meanwhile, the spellcaster over there is summoning walls of fire and creating webs that trap enemies in place, and all this fun stuff that actually tactically affects the battlefield in interesting ways that you can strategize around. So one of the ways that they've attempted to rectify this is through a new system called Weapon Masteries, and this system is so close to being great in my opinion. It's way better than what we had before because we had literally nothing in its place, but I really feel like it just needs to be pushed a little bit further for it to really shine. So to explain what the system is for those that don't know, each weapon essentially now has a mastery ability assigned to it. Martial classes get to pick a number of weapons that they have mastered, and as such can use the mastery ability of those weapons whenever they land an attack with it. So for example, if you have mastered the Great Axe, then you can use its cleave ability to hit a second person after landing the attack. Or if you master the Great Club, then you can use my personal favorite ability, Push, to immediately shove someone 10 feet as part of that attack, which can be used to knock an enemy away from a squishy ally or even push someone off of a bridge or things like that. And this is all well and good. It essentially brings martial attacks to be in line with things like a spellcaster's cantrips, which can both deal damage and have some kind of secondary effect on top of that. However, I have a couple complaints about this particular implementation. For one, because each weapon only has one mastery ability, if you want to use multiple different abilities in the same turn, you have to be constantly switching weapons all of the time, which just kinda feels awkward, especially if you're like a fighter and you might be swapping between like 4 different weapons in a single round to pull off a good combo. I'm not saying that it can't be fun and a cool strategy for some people, but it kind of feels weird that this is basically the default option. Secondly, there's just not a lot of actual mastery abilities themselves. There's a grand total of like 8 of them, and even among those 8, some of them just aren't particularly interesting. Graze, for example, allows you to deal damage even if you miss an attack, but as a result, it also means that the weapon literally does nothing when you hit with it, so it's only useful when you miss. Then there's Nick, which allows you to perform 2-weapon fighting as part of your attack action instead of having to use your bonus action, and like, that's that's nice, but it doesn't actually do anything on its own to make attacking with that weapon more interesting. It just frees up your bonus action so that classes like rogues can do something interesting with that. And then there's abilities like Sap or Topple, which can't really be triggered multiple times unless you're in combat with multiple enemies at once. So in a one-on-one scenario, your second attack is kind of wasted unless you swap weapons to use some other mastery ability like I mentioned earlier. Plus, there is kind of the long-term issue of how they will support this system going forwards. One of the reasons why spellcasters are so strong is because it is so trivial to just keep giving them more spells and adding more spells to the game, so that with every new book that comes out, every casting class gets more toys to play with. But with how the weapon mastery system is designed, you can't really add a new weapon mastery without having to create a whole new weapon to house it, and you'd probably want multiple different weapons to house that mastery so that different playstyles can get access to it. You know, like you'd want a light weapon for rogues and a heavy weapon for barbarians or fighters and whatnot. So like, it's not impossible to add new weapons and weapon masteries to the system, but it feels a lot more clunky and it takes a lot more effort than, say, just adding a new spell to the game. So how would I improve upon the system? Well, one thing I've advocated for a while as I've gone through the playtest is I think that martial classes should instead learn the mastery abilities themselves rather than mastering individual weapons. So what that would mean is that instead of, say, mastering the Great Club to learn the push ability, you would learn the push ability and then it would just be compatible with the Great Club and a number of other weapons like the pike or whatever. This would make it so that now you can use multiple different abilities with each weapon type, so that there's no longer a need to have a golf bag's worth of different weapons on your back, and it would make the system a lot easier to expand in future editions. Just adding new mastery abilities alongside new spells, and they can be compatible with various existing weapons very easily. And in general, the design space of the abilities themselves can be opened up dramatically, although I'll get more into that in a minute. Though, I will admit, there is one downside to this proposal, which is that it's not nearly as intuitive as the existing system. With the current system, you just pick a weapon, and then the ability is written right there, and you're done. With my system, each ability would have to have a set of prerequisites, and you'd have to cross-reference those with the list of all of the available weapons to figure out what good ability combos that you could do on a single weapon, and it's just a lot more hassle, and maybe they just wanted to keep it simple. So, like, okay, fine. But I have a second idea that I think is nearly as good, but still improves the system by a lot, and that is to just simply give every weapon 2 mastery abilities instead of 1. Okay, so this sounds like a really simple change, but I promise that it does a lot more good than it may initially seem. Just hear me out for a second. For one, this does still reduce the need to golf bag your weapons so much and stop having to constantly switching them, because every time you make an attack, now you get a choice of which of the 2 abilities you want to trigger. This inherently gives martial classes some more diverse options with every attack that they make, while still keeping things fairly simple to understand in my opinion. You simply just have 2 abilities written next to the weapons instead of 1. I think this also improves some existing abilities quite a bit. Take the Graze ability that I mentioned earlier. It only does something when you miss, so when you attack, you get 0 benefit out of the weapon. But now, you can have a second ability on the weapon, so that if you have, say, Push and Graze, well then now you're getting a benefit out of both missing and hitting, with the trade-off now being that you're losing out on that versatility, since you can't really choose which ability to trigger when you do land a hit. You just trigger whichever one applies to the current situation. But this also opens up lots of design space for totally new abilities as well. For example, there's currently no defensive mastery abilities, and that kinda makes sense with how they're designed. After all, if you included, say, a parry ability that gives you some benefit, like, say, reducing damage as a reaction, well then that would use up that weapon's single mastery ability, and now you get 0 benefit while actually using that weapon to attack, making it even more awkward to use than Graze is. But just like Gray's, with this system, now you can just put a second ability on that weapon to make up for that deficit. And now the weapon can have both an offensive and a defensive ability, and suddenly I just added another ability to the system just like that. And you could totally make a bunch more situational mastery abilities like that as well. Or maybe even make abilities that aren't specifically tied to attacking, like the parry ability that I just came up with. Like, what if you had abilities that you could perform as a bonus action to get some benefit? Like, here's an idea for one. Maybe some kind of ground slam. As a bonus action while you're wielding this weapon, you slam the blunt end into the ground and create a small cone of difficult terrain as the shockwaves echo the damage in the ground in front of you. That'd be great for things like clubs and warhammers and stuff as you do this epic Reinhardt hammer down kind of ability. And again, the weapon would still have a normal mastery ability that can be used when attacking as well, in addition to this more situational ability. And you can have ones that are based around attacking too, that are just more situational, like say a lunge ability that gives you an extra 5 feet of reach for that attack, which could be useful in a number of scenarios, but isn't really something that I would want as the only ability on the weapon. So it would work well as a secondary ability alongside something else. Not to mention that I feel like something akin to goading attack, which is one of the Battle Master Fighter's special abilities, like something that draws aggro to yourself on a hit, is something I think more marshals need access to, since the whole point is that they're trying to be frontliners that keep enemies away from their allies. And again, it works a lot better when that's not the only ability a weapon has, so that you can do things like goad an enemy with your first attack and then follow up with another ability without needing to swap weapons, since you can't really stack the effect with itself. And I mean, just right there with that little brainstorm that we just had, I've already expanded the number of weapon mastery abilities by literally 50% more than the current system, and it only took me like 15 minutes to write this part of the video. That's what I mean when I say that the design space is expanded so much by this one simple change. I mean, if you gave me some time to really sit down and think about it, I bet I could get the mastery ability count to over 20 by the end of the week. If you put an entire professional team on it, who knows what they could come up with. But yeah, to be fair, I think that I am far from the only person to come up with ideas like this to further improve upon the weapon mastery system. They definitely got plenty of feedback during the playtests from people like me suggesting ideas like these. But I have a feeling that the designers are probably being held back by the corporation being a bit too afraid to mix things up too much. After all, this is still an update to an existing system, and they likely didn't want to change things up too much. And like I said at the start, to be fair, I'm not saying that the current weapon mastery system is bad. It is still a significant step up over the previous systems in 5e. Plus, I will admit that the class abilities of the actual martial classes themselves, like the fighter and the barbarian, do help give them even more interesting options to play with on top of the weapon mastery system. But I just wish they had taken the system just a few steps further. I mean, just look at how many cantrips that casters get access to. There's like dozens of them, each with various buffs and debuffs, and while most of them are combat-oriented, there are also support abilities and defensive cantrips and utility cantrips all on top of that. The weapon mastery system does a lot on its own to help close that gap, sure, but it could be so much cooler if there was the design space for some more utility and defensive and more situational abilities to give marshals even more options and utility beyond just hitting things to deal damage. But, you know, I don't know. As always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Do you think I'm asking for too much? Should I just be happy with what they're giving us? Or do you agree with me in thinking that maybe they could have gone at least a little further with the weapon mastery system? I'm curious to see what other people have to say on this. But if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like, and if you want to see me make more videos like this, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make more videos in the future. If you really want to help the channel out, then you can become a member on YouTube or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.